My name is Veronica, I'm 18 years old, and I swear what happened to me that night changed everything. People always think turning 18 means freedom, that suddenly your life gets easier because you're an adult. But let me tell you, sometimes adulthood starts with the ugliest kind of betrayal. I live in a small town in Ohio, the kind where everyone knows each other's business. My dad remarried 2 years ago, and ever since, I've been stuck in a house with my stepmother, Danielle, and her 2 younger kids, Evan, who's 8, and Lily, who's 6. They aren't bad kids, but Danielle treats me less like a daughter and more like her free, live-in babysitter. If I had $1 for every time she shoved responsibility onto me, I'd probably be rich enough to have moved out already. That night, it was late, close to midnight. I had just gotten home from my part-time job at the diner. I was exhausted, grease still clinging to my clothes, my back aching from hours on my feet. I barely dropped my bag in my room before Danielle stormed in. Her makeup was smudged like she'd been out too long, and she reeked of cheap perfume and wine. "You're watching the kids," she snapped, like it wasn't even a question. I told her no. I was tired, I had school in the morning, and besides, she was their mother, not me. She didn't like that answer. The argument escalated fast. She called me ungrateful, selfish, even a useless brat. I stood my ground for once. I thought she'd yell and slam her door like usual, but instead, she marched me down the hallway, shoved me out the front door, and locked it behind me. It was pitch black, cold, and silent on that porch. My phone was in my pocket, thank God, but standing there in the middle of the night with nowhere to go, it broke something inside me. Danielle thought she'd trapped me, that I had no one. But she underestimated one thing. I had my grandmother. And when I called her, half shaking, half crying, she answered on the first ring. When my grandmother picked up the phone, I could barely get the words out. My voice was shaking, my chest tight like I couldn't breathe. "Grandma," she locked me out. She didn't even hesitate. "Stay where you are, sweetheart. I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, her headlights cut through the dark street like a lifeline. She pulled up in her old silver Buick, threw the car in park, and rushed to me with her arms open. I felt small in her embrace, like I was 5 years old again, safe and cared for. She didn't ask me to explain right away. She just said, "Come on, let's go home." We drove in silence at first, the kind of silence that feels heavy but comforting. My grandmother, her name's Marlene, isn't the type to push words out of you. She waits until you're ready. And that night, somewhere between the quiet hum of the engine and the faint smell of her lavender perfume, I broke down and told her everything. How Danielle had been treating me since Dad married her. How she used me as her free nanny, how she made me cook and clean while her kids got away with everything, how she made me feel like I didn't belong in my own house. And then, finally, how she locked me out. Marlene listened, her hands gripping the wheel tighter with each detail. "She thinks she can do this to you and get away with it," she muttered, more to herself than to me. I'll never forget the way her eyes looked in that moment, sharp, protective, almost dangerous. By the time we pulled into her driveway, she'd already made up her mind. "You're staying here with me now, Veronica. Don't worry about her. She's going to regret what she did." I went to bed that night in my grandmother's spare room, wrapped in blankets that smelled like fresh laundry, my body finally relaxing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt wanted. But the next morning, when I woke up to pounding on the door and police cars parked out front, I realized my stepmother wasn't done with me yet. The pounding on the front door jolted me out of bed. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, until I heard voices outside, sharp and demanding. I pulled on a hoodie and crept into the hallway just as my grandmother opened the door. 2 police officers stood on the porch. Behind them, parked at the curb, was Danielle's car. She was standing next to it, arms crossed, mascara streaked down her cheeks like she'd been crying. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said to my grandmother. "We're here on a welfare check. We got a call about a missing juvenile." My grandmother's eyes narrowed. "Missing juvenile?" She's not missing. She's standing right here in my house, where she belongs. The officers looked at me, and I stepped forward, my arms folded tight across my chest. Danielle spotted me and immediately started crying harder, her voice rising. Veronica. Honey, you don't understand. I was scared last night. I didn't mean to lock you out. It was an accident. Please, just come home. We can talk about this. An accident? My fists clenched at my sides. She'd shoved me out of the house. She'd turned the lock herself. And now she was standing there, acting like the victim. The officers glanced between us, clearly trying to piece together the truth. My grandmother spoke before I could. Officers, let's be clear. Danielle locked my granddaughter out of her home in the middle of the night. If Veronica hadn't called me, she could have been out there all night, anything could have happened to her. That's not a mistake, that's negligence. Danielle shook her head frantically. No, it wasn't like that. She's lying to you. She's 18, Marlene cut in sharply. She doesn't have to live under your roof anymore, Danielle. And you don't get to gaslight her into thinking this didn't happen. The taller officer turned to me. Veronica, do you want to go back to your stepmother's house? I didn't even hesitate. No. I'm staying here. Danielle's face crumpled. She stepped toward the porch, her hands clasped together like she was begging. Please, Veronica. Don't do this to me. Don't embarrass me like this. But for the first time in my life, I realized something. I wasn't the one who should be embarrassed. She was. The officers left after making a report, reminding Danielle that she had no authority over me now that I was 18. She tried one last time to get me to come with her, but I turned my back and went inside. I could hear her crying on the porch, her voice wobbling between desperation and anger, but it didn't matter anymore. That door was closed, literally and figuratively. Once the police car and Danielle's beat-up minivan pulled away, my grandmother put on a pot of coffee and sat me down at the kitchen table. The steam curled between us as she reached across and squeezed my hand. Veronica, you need to understand something, she said softly. She did this because she thought she had power over you. But she doesn't anymore. You're 18. She can't control you unless you let her. I nodded, staring into my cup. The bitter smell of coffee filled the air, grounding me. For so long, I'd felt helpless, trapped in Danielle's house, convinced that I had no way out. But now I had choices. And more than that, I had a chance to make her see that treating me like garbage had consequences. I don't just want to leave it at that, I said finally, my voice firmer than I expected. I want her to regret it. My grandmother leaned back, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Good. Then let's make a plan. She wasn't talking about anything reckless or illegal, Marlene was too smart for that. What she meant was using the truth, using her connections in town, and making sure Danielle's reputation was dragged into the light for what it really was. You know how she loves to play the perfect mom in front of people, Marlene said, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. How about we let the neighborhood, the school, and maybe even social services know exactly what she's been doing behind closed doors? The thought made a rush of adrenaline run through me. Danielle had always counted on my silence, on me being too scared to speak up. But now? I wasn't scared anymore. That night, in my grandmother's cozy kitchen, the first spark of revenge was lit. And I couldn't wait to watch it burn. The first step, my grandmother said, was gathering proof. People in our town loved gossip, but if we wanted Danielle to actually face consequences, we needed more than just stories, we needed evidence. I knew exactly where to start. For months, Danielle had been sending me long, angry texts whenever I refused to babysit or questioned her. She called me lazy, ungrateful, even dead weight. Some of the messages made my stomach twist just looking at them, but now, for the first time, they felt like ammunition. I spent that afternoon scrolling through my phone, screenshotting everything and saving it to a folder. There were messages of her threatening to throw me out on the street if I didn't obey, messages where she admitted to leaving me alone with the kids for hours while she went out drinking, and even one where she called me a mistake my dad should have left behind. When I showed them to Marlene, she pursed her lips. "This is good. Really good. Now we'll back it up with witnesses." That part was easier than I expected. Danielle loved to parade around like she was a doting mother, but she was careless. Neighbors had seen me walking Evan and Lily to school on mornings she was still in bed. Teachers knew me as the one who came to parent-teacher conferences when Danielle couldn't make it. Even the cashier at the grocery store had once whispered that she felt bad seeing me pay with my own money while Danielle bought herself wine. My grandmother called a family friend who worked at Child Protective Services and explained everything. "We'll set up a meeting," she told me, her tone steady and sure. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the scales were starting to tip in my favor. Danielle had spent years making me feel powerless, but now I had proof, allies, and a plan. That night, lying in my grandmother's spare bedroom, I thought about her face earlier when the police were on the porch, how desperate, how scared she looked when she realized she might lose control of me. And I smiled to myself. Because soon, she was going to lose a lot more than that. The following week, my grandmother drove me to the Child Protective Services office downtown. The building wasn't much, just a dull, gray structure squeezed between a dentist's office and a laundromat, but walking through those doors felt like stepping into something bigger than me. Something official. We met with a caseworker named Ms. Alvarez. She was calm, sharp-eyed, and the kind of woman who didn't waste time with small talk. She invited us into her office, sat down across from us, and folded her hands. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. I told her about being forced to babysit constantly, about Danielle disappearing for hours, about being cursed at and belittled, about being shoved out into the night like trash. My voice shook sometimes, but my grandmother's steady hand on my shoulder kept me going. When I showed Ms. Alvarez the screenshots, she leaned forward, her face tightening. "This is serious," she said. "Especially with 2 younger children involved." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me anymore. Danielle's kids, Evan and Lily, were being dragged through this mess too. I didn't hate them, they were innocent. But they were living under the same neglect I'd been forced to endure. Ms. Alvarez asked for names of neighbors, teachers, anyone who could vouch for what I was saying. My grandmother rattled off a list, her voice fierce. "She's been getting away with this for too long," she said. By the end of the meeting, a case was officially opened. A mess. Alvarez promised follow-ups, home visits, and interviews. Danielle wasn't going to be able to sweet-talk her way out of this. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter. It was like I'd finally handed over some of the weight I'd been carrying. My grandmother smiled as we stepped into the sunlight. "This is just the beginning, Veronica," she said. "She thought she could throw you away. Now we're going to show her what it feels like when the world stops believing her lies." I nodded, determination bubbling in my chest. For years, Danielle had controlled the story. But now? Now I was the one writing it. And I wasn't stopping until she was exposed. Later what she saw at Danielle's house, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Danielle opened the door in a silk robe, her hair a mess, lipstick smudged across her cheek. She tried to turn on that charm she always used with teachers and neighbors, but it didn't last. The caseworkers walked in and immediately noticed the mess. Dirty dishes stacked on the counters, food wrappers littering the living room floor, and the kids sitting cross-legged in front of the TV, still in pajamas even though it was 2 in the afternoon. Evan's shirt had chocolate stains across the front, and Lily's hair hadn't been brushed in what looked like days. When Ms. Alvarez asked Danielle about the kids' meals and routines, she snapped, "They're fine. They eat when they're hungry." Then she tried to pivot into blaming me, saying I had abandoned them and left her with all the responsibility. That's when the second caseworker asked, very directly, "Weren't you the one who locked Veronica out of the house?" According to my grandmother's friend, Danielle's face drained of all color. She stammered, denied it, then contradicted herself in the same breath. The more she talked, the deeper she dug herself into a hole. They inspected the kids' rooms. Clothes were piled everywhere, toys broken, and no clean bedding. Ms. Alvarez told her they'd be back for follow-ups and that neglect investigations were taken very seriously. Danielle tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. By the time they left, Danielle wasn't smiling anymore. She stood in her doorway, arms crossed tight, glaring at the neighborhood like she knew people had seen. And they had. Word traveled fast in our town. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an old neighbor. Heard CPS stopped by. Looks like karma finally caught up to Danielle. For the first time in a long time, I felt like justice wasn't just a fantasy, it was happening, piece by piece, right in front of me. Danielle wasn't the type to go down without a fight. I knew that much. So when my dad called me 2 nights after the CPS visit, I wasn't surprised. His voice was sharp, impatient, the way it always got when he was caught between 2 women in his life. Veronica, what the hell is going on? Danielle says you've been spreading lies about her. Do you know CPS showed up at the house? Do you have any idea what kind of damage this is causing? I sat there on my grandmother's couch, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the framed photo of him from years ago, the version of him that used to care, the dad who took me fishing on weekends and bought me ice cream after school. That man was gone. The one on the phone now sounded more worried about Danielle's reputation than about me. Dad, I said slowly, they came because of what she did. Not because of me. She locked me out of the house. She treats me like a servant. And it's not just me, Evan and Lily are being neglected too. He sighed like I was being dramatic. Danielle told me it was just a misunderstanding. She said you've been difficult, refusing to help out. You know she's been under a lot of stress. That was it. I cut him off. Don't you dare make excuses for her. I'm your daughter, Dad. And you didn't even notice what she was doing to me. Do you realize I could have been out on the street all night if I didn't have Grandma to call? Silence. Long enough that I knew my words had hit him, even if he didn't want to admit it. Finally, he muttered, "We'll talk about this later," and hung up. I sat there, phone buzzing in my hand, my grandmother watching me with that knowing look. She's trying to turn him against you, she said. But don't worry. Truth has a way of cutting through lies. We just have to keep pushing. I nodded, but inside, something shifted. If Danielle wanted a war, then she was going to get one. And I wasn't afraid anymore. If there's one thing small towns are good for, it's gossip. And in this case, gossip was my best weapon. Once word spread that CPS had shown up at Danielle's house, people started remembering things, little details they had overlooked or ignored before. At the diner where I worked, one of the regulars, Mrs. Hawkins, leaned across the counter while I poured her coffee. "Honey," she whispered, "I've seen that stepmother of yours out drinking with her friends plenty of times. Middle of the week, too. And she never had those kids with her. Don't you worry, folks are starting to see her for what she really is." It wasn't just Mrs. Hawkins. My old math teacher, Mr. Collins, stopped me outside the grocery store one evening. He told me he'd always wondered why I was the one showing up for Evan's school meetings. "I figured your stepmom was busy," he said, shaking his head. "Didn't realize it was you carrying all that weight. You did good, Veronica. You did right." Everywhere I went, it felt like someone else was quietly stepping onto my side. Some offered to talk to CPS if they needed statements. Others just gave me a look, one of those subtle, supportive nods that said we know, and we believe you. Danielle must have felt the shift, too. She started walking around town with her chin higher, her smile faker than ever, as if pretending everything was fine could erase the truth. But people weren't buying it anymore. At night, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, we made a list of everyone willing to speak up. It wasn't just about taking Danielle down anymore, it was about protecting Evan and Lily from the same neglect I'd endured. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting this battle alone. I had allies. I had proof. And I had the truth on my side. Danielle had always believed she could manipulate people, twist the story, and paint me as the problem. But now, the town was starting to see the real villain. And it wasn't me. CPS moved quickly once the interview started. Ms. Alvarez called me first, letting me know they'd be talking to neighbors, teachers, and even some of Danielle's friends. She's been painting herself as the victim, Ms. Alvarez told me over the phone. But we've heard enough to know the story doesn't line up. We just need to confirm it. And confirm it, they did. Mrs. Hawkins gave a statement about seeing Danielle out drinking multiple nights a week while I was the one walking the kids to school. Mr. Collins told them I attended more parent-teacher conferences than Danielle ever had. Even our neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, mentioned he'd heard shouting matches through the walls, Danielle's voice, sharp and cruel, yelling at me like I was her personal servant. Piece by piece, the facade Danielle had built was crumbling. Meanwhile, Danielle tried to fight back. She showed up at my grandmother's house one evening, pounding on the door until Marlene finally opened it. Danielle's face was red, her voice frantic. "You're ruining my life," she screamed. "You're turning everyone against me. Do you know what people are saying about me now? That I'm a terrible mother. That I don't care about my own kids." I stepped into the doorway beside my grandmother, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "You did that to yourself, Danielle. I didn't have to lie. All I had to do was tell the truth." Her mouth opened, then closed. For once, she didn't have a comeback. She stormed off, muttering curses under her breath, but I knew she was rattled. Later that week, Ms. Alvarez told us CPS had classified the case as substantiated neglect. That meant Danielle wasn't just being investigated, she was officially on record. And for Danielle, who lived and breathed reputation, that was the ultimate crack in her perfect facade. She was losing control. And I wasn't about to let her get it back. It didn't take long for Danielle's cracks to spread into her marriage with my dad. At first, he defended her like always. He told anyone who asked that CPS was blowing things out of proportion, and that Danielle was just under a lot of stress. But people weren't buying it anymore, and neither was he, not completely. I knew the shift had started when he called me late one night. His voice was quieter than usual, almost tired. "Veronica. I need to ask you something. Did she really lock you out? Like, physically?" I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "Yes, Dad. She shoved me out the door and turned the lock." "Do you think I'd make that up?" Silence on the other end. Then, for the first time, I heard doubt in his voice. I don't know what to believe anymore." That doubt was like a wedge between them, and Danielle knew it. From what neighbors told me, the arguments in their house got louder. Shouting matches that went on late into the night. Danielle accusing him of not supporting her, him demanding to know why she hadn't told him the full truth. The kind of fights that make a marriage bleed out slowly, drop by drop. One Saturday afternoon, I spotted Danielle's minivan pulling out of their driveway with the back stuffed full of boxes. My dad stood in the yard, hands on his hips, his face gray and worn. She sped off without even glancing at him. Later that evening, he showed up at my grandmother's house. He didn't look at me at first, just sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what I've been doing," he admitted. "I should have protected you. Instead, I let her run this family into the ground." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the first real crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Danielle was losing him. And with that, her grip on everything else was slipping faster than she could patch it. Danielle thrived on appearances. She loved being the mom who brought cookies to PDA meetings, the woman who wore expensive perfume to the grocery store, the neighbor who waved just a little too sweetly. But once CPS had her under investigation, all of that started to unravel. At church, people stopped sitting next to her. Parents whispered in the pews, side-eyeing her as she pretended nothing was wrong. At the grocery store, the same cashier who used to laugh at her jokes now barely made eye contact, just rang up her wine and sent her on her way. Even her so-called friends, the women she used to brag with at book club, turned their backs. One of them, Mrs. Sanders, actually came up to me at the diner one afternoon. She lowered her voice so only I could hear. "We didn't know how bad it was for you, Veronica. We thought you were just helping out. If I had known she was treating you like that. I'm sorry." That hit me harder than I expected. For years I'd felt invisible, like nobody noticed what I was going through. And now? Now people finally saw Danielle for what she really was. Danielle, of course, hated it. She tried doubling down, posting perfect family pictures online, acting overly affectionate with Evan and Lily in public, baking cupcakes for school like it could erase years of neglect. But the harder she tried, the faker it looked. People weren't buying her act anymore. The worst blow came when she was quietly asked not to return to the PTA board. Until things are resolved, they told her. That position was her crown jewel, her proof that she was the picture of motherhood. Losing it shattered her. I heard from neighbors that she cried in her car afterward, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. For the first time, Danielle was tasting the same isolation she had forced on me. And honestly, it felt like justice. It was only a matter of time before the legal system stepped in. CPS had done their interviews, gathered statements, and compiled reports. The case wasn't just whispers and screenshots anymore, it was official. One afternoon, Ms. Alvarez called my grandmother's house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework, when she said the words I'd been waiting for. "We're filing for a custody review of Evan and Lily." I froze, pencil slipping from my hand. My grandmother leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You mean Danielle could lose the kids?" "Depending on the judge's decision," Ms. Alvarez replied. "Neglect has been substantiated, and there are concerns about her ability to provide a stable environment. Your granddaughter's testimony, along with the witnesses we interviewed, played a huge role." For a moment, I just sat there, letting it sink in. Danielle, who had spent years treating me like I was disposable, was about to face the possibility of losing the very children she used as props in her performance of perfect mom. When I told my dad, he didn't get angry this time. He just rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. If that's what's best for them, maybe it needs to happen. It wasn't easy for him, those were his stepkids, after all, but even he couldn't deny the truth anymore. The court date was set for a month later. Danielle was furious. She tried calling me, leaving voicemails filled with venom, blaming me for ruining her life, accusing me of betrayal. I didn't respond to a single one. Instead, I spent that time preparing. I wrote down everything I could remember, times she left me alone with the kids, times she screamed at me, times she put herself above everyone else. My grandmother kept reminding me, "The truth is enough, Veronica. That's all you need." For once, I believed her. Danielle's world was shrinking, fast. And soon, the judge would decide just how much she was about to lose. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, the kind of place where lives quietly change behind heavy doors. On the morning of the custody hearing, I sat beside my grandmother on a wooden bench, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles turned white. Danielle arrived late, of course, storming in with a bright red blazer and too much perfume, dragging Evan and Lily behind her like accessories. She tried to smile, like this was some misunderstanding we'd all laugh about later, but the dark circles under her eyes gave her away. When the judge called us in, everything suddenly felt real. Danielle's lawyer painted her as a struggling but loving mother who had been unfairly targeted. I nearly rolled my eyes. Then it was my turn. I stood at the witness stand, palms sweating, heart pounding. But when the judge asked me to tell my story, the words came easier than I expected. I told him about the countless nights I'd been left to watch Evan and Lily while Danielle was out. I explained how I had been the one making meals, helping with homework, getting them to bed. I described the night she locked me outside, my voice shaking at first, then steadying as I saw the judge's expression harden. I handed over the screenshots of her texts, each one uglier than the last. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of paper being shuffled. Danielle tried to interrupt, blurting out, "She's exaggerating. She hated me from the start." But the judge quickly silenced her. Then, witnesses came forward. Mr. Collins, my teacher, spoke about how I had filled in as a parent. Mrs. Hawkins testified about seeing Danielle out drinking. One by one, the truth was spoken aloud, undeniable. By the end of it, Danielle wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. For the first time in my life, I felt like my voice mattered. Like the years of being silenced and dismissed were finally being undone. And when the judge announced his decision, Danielle's world collapsed. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady, carrying the weight of finality. Based on the testimony, evidence, and corroborating witness statements, this court finds sufficient grounds to declare that Danielle is unfit to retain primary custody of Evan and Lily. Custody will be transferred to their father with oversight from Child Protective Services. Danielle will be granted supervised visitation until further review. The words hung in the air like a gavel strike before the actual gavel came down. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment, I didn't move. Then I felt my grandmother's hand squeeze mine. Danielle gasped like someone had punched her. "No. You can't do this," she shouted, her voice breaking into something between rage and desperation. "They're my children." The judge's eyes narrowed. "They are not possessions, Mrs. Carter. They are children. And they deserve stability and care." She collapsed back into her chair, mascara running, hands covering her face. The same woman who once strutted around town like she was untouchable was now shaking in front of everyone. When it was over, Evan and Lily clung to my dad. They didn't cry, they just looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted off their small shoulders. My dad looked at me across the courtroom, eyes glassy. "Thank you," he mouthed. For once, I believed he meant it. Walking out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in years. I wasn't just leaving a building, I was leaving behind years of being dismissed, ignored, and treated like I didn't matter. Danielle had tried to break me. She thought she could silence me, control me, throw me away like I was nothing. But in the end, it was her lies, her cruelty, and her neglect that destroyed her. I had my grandmother's strength, the town's support, and most importantly, I had my voice. And as I stepped out onto those courthouse steps, I knew one thing for sure. This was my victory. And it was only the beginning of the life I was finally free to build.